Perfect. So hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Jen Robertson, as she said. I am we'll call it the new Director of Education. I have been the Director of Education for the last year, but Jennifer Wilcox, as some of you may have been presented by before, officially retired about 3 weeks ago. Although don't go too far. She was on the National Archives tonight talking. So today we are going to be talking about the Battle of Codes, and specifically that's going to entail World War II. We will briefly touch on Joe Desch as well. At the end, I will open it up for a few minutes of questions. So if I can't answer anything, I absolutely will. And that includes if you have any questions on the museum itself. Okay. Let me make sure everything's moving. Okay, looks like things are going around. So governments and militaries have long sought ways to keep their communication secret from their adversaries and even some of their own allies. And so knowing an adversary's intentions in diplomacy can really aid in negotiations. And knowing what your enemy is planning also can make the difference in battle. And this dates back as far as Julius Caesar with a simple encryption that he used to keep battle plans secret. So Caesar used a simple cipher, and what he did was he just changed one letter. So instead of writing A, he actually shifted it 3 places to D. And it worked for a while, but over time, people learned ways to break into these monoalphabetic substitutions. And so in our message, S is always ciphered to V. In the case of polyalphabetic substitution, it allows for a single cipher letter to be different than their plain text letters, meaning each plain text letter can be represented by a different cipher letter, making it more difficult for the enemy to break. And a key then has to determine the alignment of the letters and when you shift to a new cipher position. So if we use the word cryptology as our key, and we use the line, let's see, A here as the outer disk as our indicator, then that means C is lined up with A, okay? Which then makes the M in our message become Q. The next letter then moves to R in cryptology. And now we have to line up E. Yep, so A is now in the indicator with R, and now our E becomes N. And so we turn the disk again. Same thing with, and now it turns into an N. And this is how we continue. So now A will line up with Y, and it will now change into a different letter again. So now S is G. Polyalphabetic is not unbreakable, but it does make it significantly harder to solve because you have to know that keyword. It also slows down anybody who's trying to break into it. But nonetheless, these are all paper and pencil. These are very simple devices that were used for centuries. So it's not actually, oh, there we go. And one more thing, as you can see, both of our S's are now 2 different letters, G and X. This is how you can tell it's a polyalphabetic substitution. Monoalphabetic, they'll always be the same letters. So if it's V, A, whatever, they'll all be the same. So by the early part of the 20th century, several people had started inventing wired rotors for encryption to be used as part of an electric typewriter. Electricity passes through the input letter through a maze of wires into a different output letter, encrypting messages basically as fast as they could type. And then the rotor moved. So even typing the same letter would cause the electricity to flow down a different path, ciphering it to a different letter and creating a polyalphabetic cipher that is secure. Adding additional rotors to the machines meant that electricity can pass through multiple wire mazes before completing its encryption path, making the cipher extremely complex. The most famous of these devices, of these wired rotored machines, was the World War II Enigma. And it used 3 rotors, but also a reflecting plate to send the electricity through the rotors a second time and a plug board. So combined, each letter could change 7 to 9 times before the cipher letter would light up on the panel. There is no printer on these machines because it had to be portable to be used in the field. So these are two-person type of machines. These rotors moved to create a polyalphabetic system that was so successful. And with each keystroke, the rightmost rotor will move 1 step forward. When that has moved 26 times, then the middle one will step forward. And when that has gone 26 times, then the left rotor will move a step forward. So think similar to a car odometer, okay? That repeatable motion. You could hit the same key 16,900 times in a row before a ciphering pattern would repeat itself. And that's assuming you don't change anything about the machine. So, but things do change, as we know. Okay. And there are different rotors that could be inserted, and the order, the left, right, center, could also be changed. The plug board could be replugged, and a few other things, all of which convinced Germans that there was no way anyone could break Enigma messages in a reasonable time if they didn't know the key. So to decrypt a message, the receiver needed to have his Enigma set up exactly the same way as his sender. And to do this, they had a key list, which you see here on the left. For each day, the list told them which rotors to put in the machine and what order, left, right, center, how to plug in the plug board, and a few other things. Without that list, the Germans believed the Allies would not be able to read their messages. And Germans even began using these before the war even started and issued the enigmas to all of his services. Army, Navy, Air Force, as well as some other things like secret police, weather units, and trains. Okay. But in the early 1930s, as tensions were rising around the German Nazi Party, a Polish cipher bureau recruited mathematicians to break into the enigma and the encrypted message. With only intercepted ciphertext, Marian Rejewski couldn't solve the machine until a disgruntled employee of the German cipher office sold Enigma keyless. His name was Hans Thilo Schmidt, by the way. And with the key for the day and the cipher for the day, he was actually able to work through the math and determine the wiring for the machine. But Poland didn't always have access to key lifts. And he and the other mathematicians needed to find ways to find these keys on their own, and in time make use of the information they could get from the Enigma messages. So they designed a machine that could mimic an Enigma and check all the settings on the wheel order, and they called it the Bomba. Bomba. I believe that actually it was named after a dessert. So great code name for this. And then the war began. So September 1st in 1939, Germany began to invade Poland. And fortunately, just 2 weeks earlier, knowing that time was running short, the Cipher Bureau had already given the information to the French and the British to help break the Enigma. Britain's government code and cipher school also hired mathematicians, including Alan Turing, to work against the Axis's encrypted communications at their new headquarters known as Bletchley Park outside of London. And after being briefed on the Polish work, Turing began to design an improved Bomba machine. And he realized that searching for the one right key setting was actually not the solution. So he created the British BOMB, B-O-M-B-E, to search for all the wrong answers so that they could throw them away. The British bombs could rapidly check an electrical pathway on the 3 sets of rotors simultaneously. The bombs searched for a path that allowed one letter to move to its assigned counterpart, discarding any that did not meet the requirements. So, for example, the British intercepted this test message from a German Air Force, knowing or assuming that the word Ambisprüch or test message appeared at the end of the text, allowed the bomb then to search for the rotor order and position that allowed it to work. The red notes at the bottom indicated how to set up the bomb to search for these connections. And finding the daily keys within several hours allowed the British to decrypt the German messages for the rest of the day and combat their actions. The German Navy messages were harder to break because they had a total of 8 rotors to choose from for the 3 machines. It wasn't until the British captured a couple of German U-boats with sailors who had the rotors in their pockets that they learned about the wiring of the extra 3 rotors. For a year, the U-boat fleet sank as much of the Allied shipping in the Atlantic because the British could not read the U-boat messages. But once the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park started finding these Enigma settings too, the British forces were able to successfully attack those U-boats. And Admiral Dönitz here realized that his submarines were not successful as they had been and suspected that the Enigma had been solved. Despite Germans' high command being reassured that the Enigma could not be broken, Dönitz believed it has and changed the U-boat Enigmas. He couldn't change the machines too much because they still had to work with the Navy and the weather messages. But he did squeeze in a 4th rotor, and it worked perfectly well in their 3 rotor systems too. And Britain knew they had the extra rotor that was coming, and they were intercepting and reading the messages to the U-boats, telling them to pick up their 4 rotor machines the next time they're in port. But until someone actually used all 4 rotors, Britain would not be able to determine the wiring. So fortunately, a German code clerk used all 4 rotors to encrypt a message that they radioed out. He realized he wasn't supposed to use the 4 rotors yet, and then encrypted the exact same message using the 3 rotors and radioed that one out too. Britain intercepted both. And they used the bombs to find the settings for the 3 rotor message and then used that to determine the wiring of the 4th rotor. However, when the 4th rotor went into official use, the British bombs could only search for the 3 rotor settings. And they had to modify their machines to handle the 4th rotor, and that would take time. So more time than Americans, who were now in the war too, wanted to wait. So the U-boats sank so many ships in the spring of 1942 off the coast of the US East Coast that the Germans were calling it the happy times. And the US Navy needed to read all 4 rotor Enigma messages immediately. So the Navy contracted with the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, and their research engineer, Joe Desch, to build the US bomb that could work on the 4 rotor Enigmas. The US bombs work the same way as the British machines. After the cryptanalysts determined the menu, a Navy wave, the women in Navy, or also known as the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, set the bomb according to the menu. The machine checked a specific wheel order, looking for an electrical path that could move from one letter to the assigned counterpart. In this case, the bomb checked to see if using the assigned rotor order at this position, did the electricity go from 20 to 0 or U to A? A was 0, Z was 25, just to make it harder for people to memorize. And if it didn't, then the bottom rotor, number 4 on our list, moves forward 1 step, just like the Enigmas would. So the bomb was able to check over 450,000 possible solutions in only 20 minutes. Sorry, settings, not solutions. And each bomb run resulted in 2 to 3 possible correct solutions. And remember, like the British machines, the bomb isn't looking for one right answer. It's checking for wrong ones and throwing them out. So when it finds a path that clears all the dials, it has a possible solution, but not the right solution. So a wave would then take those results and test them on an M9 checker. And if the cipher she tapped resulted in German, she had a correct solution and she'd yell jackpot. But usually none of her solutions were correct and she'd reset the bombs using a different wheel order. Eventually someone would hit the jackpot to the solution and then went back to the cryptanalyst for decryption, translation, and distribution. So because the US bombs were, Navy bombs, were able to quickly find the daily settings for the 4 rotor U-boat Enigmas, Cryptologists were actually able to read many of the U-boat messages, sometimes in near real time. And this allowed the Americans and its allies to find and attack German U-boats much more successfully. However, the war wasn't just in the Atlantic, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, pulled America into World War II and expanded the fight into the Pacific. So even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Service was interested in Japanese communications. However, their focus was on diplomatic messages, not the military. And the men and women, soldiers and civilians, were struggling to break into the Japanese system that they called Purple. And this system was far different than they had seen before, and it became a cryptanalyst's highest priority. So cryptanalysts studied the unknown system for 18 months. And one of the reasons Purple was so difficult to break is because it was super enciphered. The Japanese encoded the message first and then ciphered the code on their encryption machine. Much like the German Enigma messages, the Army cryptanalysts needed to find cribs, assumed plain text within the message. And if the messages were encoded first, it made it difficult to find that crib. So for example, the Japanese took their message and encoded the words, numbers, and punctuation using a code book. In this case, the Phillips code for the word number is XFC. And the code for that number, 15, is GJW. Okay? And so on. They would then type these code groups into their Purple cipher machine, okay, and encrypt the code. Even if the Japanese repeatedly used the code XFC, each time they entered it on the Purple machine, they'd actually get a different cipher group. So you can see how difficult it would be to solve. Okay. So then this would be the cipher, and this would be the code group underneath of it. So it's enciphered and then enciphered again. It's basically the easiest way to say that. So finally, after 18 months of looking at the ciphered message, a young civilian mathematician, Genevieve Grosjean, found something. This led to another and then another. So she excitedly interrupted her boss, Mr. Frank Rowlett, and asked him to look at what she found. Showing the sheets and spreading them across her desk, Rowlett immediately realized what she had found and cried out, "You did it!" Other mathematicians came over to see what she was working on and began cheering. Jean had broke Purple, and so to celebrate, they ordered a round of Coca-Cola for everyone. After seeing Genevieve's links and the other cryptanalysts knew what to look for in their own ciphered message, they too began finding more correlations and links. And it wasn't long before they had paper and pencil method to solve Purple messages. 1 week later, the SIS read the first decrypted Purple message. The process, however, was slow, cumbersome, and required several analysts to complete. So engineer Leo Rosen took their solution and designed a machine that duplicated the function of the Japanese encryptor. Without ever seeing a Japanese machine, Rosen determined that telephone switching units could be used to replicate the necessary stepping motion. Later, an actual piece of Japan's Purple was found, and it too used telephone switching units for its encryption. I like to say I could explain, if you had never seen a car before, and I could let you touch a piece of leather, I could let you smell exhaust, I could show you paint samples, but if I still told you to draw a car, it still wouldn't come out the same, right? So this is a massive feat. And this is the biggest piece of Purple, and this is actually an artifact that we have in the museum. It's the biggest piece of known Purple. So the piece that was found in the courtyard of the Japanese embassy in Berlin in 1945, that's that piece up at the top. It was part of the encryption system used by Oshima Hiroshi, the ambassador to the Third Reich. The encryption machine, as it should have been, was smashed and buried as the Americans entered Berlin. So this is what the soldiers dug up from the wreckage of the embassy. Before and throughout the war, the Germans gave Oshima tours of their works, and discussed important economic, political, and military secrets with him. He dutifully reported these meetings in long detail to his leadership in Tokyo, using purple to encrypt them. The SIS used their purple analog to decipher his messages, providing them with extremely valuable information about Japan's policies and intentions, but also details Oshima relayed concerning the Germans' plans and their capabilities. So it ended up being a gold mine for the US and played a critical role in the strategic planning for the invasion of Normandy in 1944. However, because purple was for diplomatic communications, it didn't provide much about Japanese military plans. SIS worked hard on the Japanese Army communications, including their water transport codes. There were shipping lanes from the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia today, to Japan, bringing in oil and raw materials. And there were also routes from Japan to their troops on the island chains of the Pacific. The Japanese needed to keep these supply chains open if they intended to support their people at home and continue to wage war. By the end of 1942, the long hours and the Army cryptanalysts spent sorting traffic and mapping radio networks did yield results. They learned that the Japanese Army traffic broke down into two groups, each of which had the same 4-digit first number. One of those first numbers was 2468, and this identified the code book used by the Japanese water transport system. Normally, after a certain point, the Japanese would replace their code books with a new one so that enemy cryptanalysts could not piece anything together just by the book alone or comparing repetitive code groups. However, due to their far-flung and rapid expansion throughout the Pacific, the Japanese couldn't replace the 2468 easily. So they decided to super encipher it instead. Ironically, the method they chose to encrypt the code actually weakened the system. So the American cryptanalysts did figure it out. However, using the substitution squares made it far easier to solve, and that's beyond my comparison. I'm not a cryptanalyst. However, the fact is that these crypties noted that for each 3-week period, some things within the indicator code group were not random. The first number of the indicator seemed to be limited as to which numbers were used during the 3-week period. And there appeared to be a relationship between the first number on the indicator cipher and the first 2 numbers on the next indicator cipher. Again, I don't know how, why, or what, but that is how it worked. So using these cryptanalytic techniques developed by the chief of the Army Signal Intelligence Service earlier, multiple teams were able to recreate the Japanese substitution squares that changed every 3 weeks. And it wasn't long before the Allies working in Washington, Australia, and England were reading current water transport code messages. And even though these weren't Army cryptologists, they passed the information on to the Navy as quickly as possible through the Joint Intelligence Center, the Pacific Ocean Area Office in Hawaii. Information from this Joint Operations Center was transmitted to the submarines on a special cipher system only used by the subs. And each day at noon, the Japanese ships in the water transport system had to send encrypted messages giving their location and other mission-related information. By knowing the shipping routes and reports from the transport code messages, the Allies were able to inflict heavy damage to their supply ships. So the chief of Combat Intelligence Unit in Hawaii later said, there were nights when nearly every American submarine on patrol in the Central Pacific was working on the basis of information derived from cryptanalysis. It got to the point that the sub commanders complained if Japanese convoy didn't arrive on schedule according to the decrypt. So decrypted message information was so complete concerning the Japanese minefields that it actually made targeting easier for the US. To avoid their own mines, the Japanese were forced through narrow shipping lanes, and the US subs could easily locate and attack them. So the oil and raw materials needed to support Japan, both at home and their island outposts, were devastated by the US Navy's ability to attack the supply routes. And the loss of these supplies crippled the Japanese forces by the end of the war. Another unexpected advantage was the highly successful use of the water transport code decryption. Was that the Japanese vastly overestimated the size of the American submarine fleet. A Japanese prisoner told his interrogator in 1945 that it was a common saying among the Japanese forces that a person could walk from Singapore to Japan on American periscopes. But there were other codes that needed breaking in the battles of the Pacific to be successful. And the Japanese fleet code needed to be solved. The US Navy was struggling with a code that they called JN25B. So the Japanese, having missed the aircraft carriers that were out of port at Pearl Harbor, planned a surprise attack on Midway Island to draw the US fleet there. They hoped to demolish them before the US industrial abilities could become in full swing, and demoralizing and critically wounding the American war efforts. A cryptologic team headed up by Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo in Hawaii was working 24/7 trying to decode the Japanese Navy messages. But again, these messages were super enciphered using additive tables. But once again, the crypt analysts, this time in the Navy, began reconstructing those tables so they could strip off some of the cipher and recreate the code. And in the spring of 1942, they made breaks and began reading some portions of the JN25 message. Only portions, they never read the full messages. And although they could only read 10 to 15% of that messaging, Rochefort believed that the Japanese were gearing up for an attack in Central Pacific. However, the only clue to the actual location was the Japanese codename AF. Rochefort thought AF referred to Midway Island, but had no proof. So Midway, strategically located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, would benefit the Japanese greatly. If they could lure Americans in to protect their base, the Japanese thought they'd be able to decimate more of the American fleet. And it would also extend their perimeter into the Pacific by about 2,000 more miles and set them up for an invasion at Hawaii. Rochefort did not know Japan's full intentions, but knew Midway was a prime location for an attack. However, without decrypts to back him up, he needed some way to prove his theory to decision makers in Washington. So Rochefort proposed the plan to the commander-in-chief at the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz. And he suggested that the Marines stationed on Midway send out a message in plain English over the radio that he knew that the Japanese would hear and understand. It's a message they sent out several times before. And it would report that the desalinization plant was broken and they were running short of fresh drinking water. Nimitz agreed with him. Shortly after that, an unencrypted message was sent from Midway. The crypt analyst at Station Hypo deciphered a JN25 message that read, AF is short of fresh water. Bingo. This proved that the target AF was Midway and convinced the leaders in Washington as well. The bulk of the Pacific Fleet was then sent to Midway. The Americans lost a lot of men in the opening hours of the battle, but in the end, they inflicted such heavy damage on the Japanese fleet. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 332 planes, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 2,500 men. Some of those that died were their best fighter pilots, and a loss that they were not going to be able to recoup. The Battle of Midway is considered to be the turning point in the Battle of the Pacific. So throughout World War II, the Americans had success against both the German and Japanese communications. However, they didn't want their enemies understanding their own messages. So to protect these high-level communications, the US had a Sagaba machine. also known as the ECM if you're in the Army. Like the Enigma and some of the other high-level German machines, it used wired rotors for its encryption method. But unlike the Enigma, the stepping motion was not a one step forward with each keystroke. It actually appears to be unpredictable. It wasn't truly random because it wouldn't be able to be deciphered on the other end. But the stepping motion of 5 cipher wheels actually determined the wiring of the first set of permanent rotors and the second set of interchangeable rotors. Then the last set of those rotors resulted in the encryption, which was printed out on paper. And because the stepping motion and wiring of the machine was so complicated, there's actually no instance of Sagaba messages being read by the Axis powers. Among many other messages, Sagaba was the one that was protecting our communication plans for D-Day. We saw 3 and 4 rotor enigmas for the Germans. The Sagaba had 15, just to show you the difference in size. So voice commands were also partially difficult to protect, particularly difficult to protect, I should say. The US had voice encryption capabilities, but they were heavy and unreliable. So the US Army and Marine Corps turned to Native Americans and their unique languages to secure communications. Dozens of Native American tribes were recruited in the US Army as communicators. The Choctaw, Comanche, Winnebago, the Hopi, and others. The Army used as many as 30 different tribes as code talkers. The Marine Corps chose to exclusively use the Navajo as their code talkers. These men not only translated English orders into their native language, but also created code words to replace some military or commonly used terms. The dictionaries they developed replaced the English terms with common words for their native languages, but each tribe created their own codes. For example, the word hospital became encoded in Navajo as a place of medicine, whereas the Comanche called it a medicine house. Machine gun in Navajo is rapid fire gun, but in Comanche, it was called a sewing machine. However, the code talkers didn't carry around their dictionaries. They committed everything to memory. And this is why the code words in some ways resemble the military thing that they encoded. Hospitals are places or houses of medicines. Machine guns rapidly fire, making the same sound as a sewing machine. So with these hints, the code talkers would be reminded of those military terms. So these are actually some Navajo code words. I'll give you a minute to see if you maybe can guess any of these. So a tortoise there up at the top. A tortoise is slow, it's green, it's got a hard shell. Does it remind you of a tank? Iron fish would be submarine. A whale, I always like a whale because some people think it's it's a battleship, right? Big old ship in the middle of it. My favorite is down there at the bottom right, a bull sleep. You and I would see it on a construction site. It is a bulldozer. That one's a good one to me. So they always have something in common with them. A chicken hawk is a dive bomber. And if you ignore the arms and the legs, a potato is a grenade. So using Native Americans as communicators proved extremely successful. And because they only spoke their native language, it was fast. So unlike mechanical encryption, where the only delay is the repeat, the only delay was actually the repeat of the message in English to the commander. And it was secure because the enemy, or anyone else for that matter, isn't going to understate or translate the message. And it was authenticated. The speakers knew anyone answering them in their language was guaranteed to be American. There had been concern that the enemy might get on the radio and speak in English and might be mistaken as an American and give out false orders. But if they spoke Navajo, Comanche, or any of these other languages, they had to be American because the enemy didn't have anyone who could speak those languages. Native American code talkers protected the battlefield communication. but the military and political leaders needed to make sure they're secure as well in their communications. So the US Army worked with Bell Labs to design a secure telephone system called Sig Sally. And this is only a small portion of the machine. It had 40 racks of equipment and weighed 55 tons. It took 12 people 15 minutes to set up a phone call. And those conference calls had to be scheduled in advance. The encryption was done, though, recordings of purely random noise, and 3 copies were made, one for the sender, one for the receiver, and a master that was kept in the library. Each record lasts 12 and a half minutes, so they had to segue into the next album seamlessly so the phone call wouldn't be disrupted. If at any point they got out of sync, though, the phone call would sound like a hornet buzzing. And as much technical marvel as Sig Sally was, the leaders did not particularly like the way they sounded on the machine. Because the voice was digitized and encrypted, and then decrypted and then converted back into analog and then synthesized again, the voices sounded robotic. Nonetheless, because Sig Sally used random noise as the encryption pattern, the system was unbreakable. And today, this is actually the great great grandfather of noise canceling headphones. We went from 55 tons to a few ounces on your head. Not every system was used by the Allies, was as successful as Sagaba, the Code Talkers, or even Sig Sally. The Axis powers could read some US communications on some occasions, and nor were the Allies breaking every message sent by the Axis power. But there were enough Allied successes making and breaking the codes that gave many Allies advantages throughout the war. In case you are ever in Maryland, we are open Monday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. On the left here is a little bit more about us if you'd like to contact us. And down at the bottom, you can actually request publications. We have some wonderful ones actually written about the enigmas, women in cryptography, many others that you can actually request and have sent to you. That is actually all I have for my presentation, and I would happily answer